Hello, this week you read David Foster Wallace's 24 word notes. It's kind of our way of jumping into our usage and mechanics units this semester. One of the little sections of that piece he dedicated to talking about that and which and the usage and mechanics of those. And so we're going to take a closer look at a couple of sentences that he used in that piece. The first is, we have a massive SUV that we purchased on credit last month. Okay, this is what we call a complex sentence because it has an independent clause and a dependent clause. I've highlighted the independent clause, which is the part that can stand on its own as a sentence because it expresses a complete thought. So the subject here is we, the verb is have, and the object of that verb is SUV. We, what do? We have, what do we have? An SUV. And a and massive are describing the SUV. Okay, nothing too complicated there. At the tail end of the sentence, we have a couple of phrases I'd like to talk about. First is a prepositional phrase, on credit. On is the preposition, credit is the object. And remember, objects of prepositions have to be nouns or pronouns. And then here's something kind of new. It's called an adverbial phrase, and it's a group of words that's describing something else in the sentence. And if we take a look, we realize that it's not any of the nouns or pronouns that it's describing. It's actually describing the verb purchased, okay? There are such things as adjective phrases, and those describe nouns or pronouns because adjectives describe nouns or pronouns. This is called an adverbial phrase because it's describing a verb, and adverbs describe verbs, adverbs, or adjectives. Again, the names of these things are not really important. I don't care if you know that this is an adverbial phrase, but I do want you to recognize what it's modifying. So last month is giving us more information about or modifying the verb purchased. Okay, we talked about those things. Now what's left? We have three words, but they're kind of important words. That we purchased. And this is what we call a dependent clause, specifically a relative clause. The subject, we have another set of subject and verb, we purchased, connected to the rest of the sentence by the relative pronoun that. Okay. Now, so far I've used a couple of different words that I want to define a little more clearly for you. A clause is a group of words with both a subject and a verb. So we have an independent clause that has a set of subject and verb, we have, and we have a dependent clause, subject and verb, we purchased. A phrase, on the other hand, is a group of words without both a subject and a verb. We have the prepositional phrase, on credit. Okay, credit is a noun, but it's not a subject of anything, and there's no verb there. So that's a phrase, it's not a clause. You can have independent clauses, which could stand by themselves, or dependent clauses, which rely on the independent clause. Okay, a sentence must have at least one independent clause. They can have more than that. They can have 0 dependent clauses. They can have 1 dependent clause. They can have 25 dependent clauses. That's all up in the air, but we know for sure that a sentence has to have 1 independent clause. And then here we have our independent clause and our dependent clause. The final two phrases that we were talking about technically are attached to that dependent clause. Okay, now we've got our second sentence from that little article or essay, whatever you want to call it. You'll see much of the same language here, just rearranged a little differently. The massive SUV, which we purchased on credit last month, seats us 10 feet above any other driver on the road. Okay. I've bolded the independent clause and underlined the dependent clause. In our first example, the independent clause sat nicely together at the beginning of the sentence, and the dependent or relative clause sat at the end. We don't have that in this example. You can see that our relative clause, which we purchased on credit last month, is actually like a wedge separating the beginning from the end of the sentence, okay? But we can remove that dependent clause and still have a sentence that makes sense. So our independent clause is, the massive SUV seats us 10 feet above any other driver on the road. And the dependent clause is, which we purchased on credit last month. Because if you just read the dependent clause, it doesn't express a complete thought. It doesn't make real sense. Okay, so here's our breakdown of subject and verb. SUV does what? It seats. Who does it seat? Us. What's the subject of the dependent clause? We. What did we do? We purchased, and there's no direct object, so there's no answer to the question, we purchased what, okay? Unless you want to think of which as being the direct object, which is a totally reasonable thing to do. So sometimes you'll have the word linking into the rest of the sentence, and it'll be serving another purpose like the subject or the object. All right. We have phrases. Inside the dependent clause, the phrases are basically the same as our first example. Inside the independent clause, we have an adjective phrase, 10 feet, which is describing us. Us is a noun or a pronoun. It's a pronoun, so it's an adjective phrase and not an adverbial phrase. Then we have two prepositional phrases, above any other driver and on the road. Okay, we've talked about prep phrases before. So these were two examples from his piece, and I wanted to throw a third one your way so we can talk about how it's working in a similar way, but also in a different way at the same time. So here's a sentence. The tree limb that fell during last night's storm landed on our house. Okay, so if we break it down, again, we have our independent clause split up by a dependent clause. We have part of the independent clause at the beginning of the sentence and part at the end. The independent clause is the tree limb landed on our house. That makes sense if we read it by itself. But if we just read that fell during last night's storm, that does not make sense. Okay, it has a subject and a verb. It has the subject that and a verb fell, but it does not express a complete thought. At the end, we have a prepositional phrase during last night's storm in the dependent clause, and in the independent clause, we have a prepositional phrase on our house. Okay, so I want to point something out to you. So in the previous examples, that or which merely signaled the beginning of the dependent or relative clause. Okay, they're sort of like the flag word. You see which, you see that, you recognize that a certain kind of thing is probably going to happen. But that was the only way they were being used. However, in this case, things are a little bit different. Sometimes that or which signal the beginning of the dependent clause, and they serve as the subject of that clause. So if we go back a slide, we see our dependent clause is that fell during last night's storm. We can recognize the verb right away as fell. The question to figure out what the subject is, what fell? Okay, that fell. And that is a relative pronoun. It's relating to limb. It's kind of renaming limb. So that is serving as the marker word, the little flag word, but it's also serving as the subject. So sometimes you'll have that followed by a subject, and sometimes you will have that or which serving as the subject. Okay, so here are our three examples. I also want to point out that we have, in these three sentences, only 2 commas. Typically, when you're using that, the word that is indicating that the information that follows is necessary to understand the sentence. Okay, it's important enough that you can't really take it out. When you use which, however, that's suggesting to your reader that this is kind of like an aside. It's extra information, not totally necessary to the understanding of the sentence. Which is why in our second example here, the massive SUV, comma, which we purchased on credit last month, comma, seats us 10 feet above any other driver on the road, is separated by commas. The dependent clause is sort of isolated with commas on either side because it's not really information that's necessary to the sentence. Okay? In the first one, it's important to know we have a massive SUV that we purchased on credit last month. That's irrelevant information because of the trajectory of what's going to be said later or what's happening in that sentence. Then the third example, the tree limb that fell during last night's storm landed on our house. What tree limb? The one that fell during last night's storm. Okay, so this is information that it's a little bit more necessary for the understanding of the sentence. So that's why we don't have commas there, because commas, among other things, indicate that you can take out whatever between the commas and not really injure the main content of the sentence. Okay, so final takeaways. What are some things that I want you to really understand after this video? Relative pronouns that and which often indicate the beginning of a dependent clause. Okay, I think we know that. Sometimes these words serve both as the marker or flag word and the subject of the dependent clause. That's the third example, right? The tree limb that fell. That is indicating the beginning of our dependent clause, but it's also serving as the subject. What fell? That fell. There's no need to use a comma with that clauses because that suggests that the information contained in the clause is necessary, but use a comma with which clauses because they typically indicate that the information in the clause is not necessary. That's all I've got for now in this video on that and which. We'll have one other short video on that in a second.